Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. Today I have a very special guest all the way from the United Kingdom, fresh from its new prime minister, which was appointed today, Harry Robinson, who's a great documentarian. I was brought to your work by a documentary called The Real Black Sabbath, and about the ISUPK group in Oklahoma, and then I evolved from that into some of your other work. So welcome to the Gritty Hour.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor that you're interested in what I have to say.
Very interested, and we're honored to have you. So tell us a little about your work.
So the Real Black Sabbath is my debut, I guess, into kind of documentaries. I'm 22. So I'm still a student journalist, but I mean, I spent the last year in the University of Oklahoma. I'm now back in the UK, but when I went away, my kind of dream since I ever wanted to be a journalist was to do a documentary.
Right.
And I was lucky enough to kind of be facilitated by the university and do it with a kind of skeleton crew and have, my mate Adam, do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of lugging a camera around for hours and hours on end. And I mean, that's other than that, I'm a journalist kind of by nature, so like by newspapers and stuff like that. And I also host a podcast very similar to this, where I interview interesting people. I mean, I say very similar to this. I'm hoping you find me interesting.
Yeah, definitely. The name of the podcast is All Out Attack. Mm-hmm. And you can find it. I'm going to direct people in the show notes to your YouTube page, which is the video portion. You work similarly to the way we do, where we have a video element, but the bulk of the thing is on audio. And All Out Attack is the name of the podcast. Mm-hmm. But you can also see some of his other documentaries. So you said you did this through your college. Do you want to mention the college?
Yeah. So I mean, I go to the University of Sheffield here, but I did a year studying abroad. I mean, with COVID kind of kicking off, like my university experience was kind of robbed a bit. I mean, like over here it's kind of about you do the course, but you drink a lot of beer and all that kind of stuff, and that was kind of stripped away. So me and my friend Adam, who was also on my course, who was the cinematographer for the documentary, we went to the University of Oklahoma, which was one of the few universities that was still allowing students to come over, because they're pretty blasé about COVID and kind of regulations over there. And and so at the University of Oklahoma there's a man called Mike Betcher. So Mike was the first ever live reporter for CNN. The man is legendary in terms of kind of journalism, and he really took us both under his wing and helped me through this kind of documentary process. And but by the end of it, we'd filmed with the ISUPK, this Hebrew Israelite group, and ended up winning 2 awards from it, which for a kind of skeleton crew of about 3 people.
Yeah, well, it's a very
no experience really. It's
a very interesting documentary and well done. But how did you get? So you studied in the University of Oklahoma as an exchange student. How did you get involved? What directed you to the ISPU organization?
Originally, the University of Oklahoma has a lot of great equipment, like unbelievable equipment, and it was all like, if you're a student, you could just rent it out for the day, kind of thing. Because otherwise, I mean, I'm from a very working class background in the UK. I don't have the expendable income to buy a posh camera or anything.
Right.
And and then I got in touch with them basically through the fact of I was looking at there's a group, like an organization called the Southern Poverty Law Center, who I speak to in the documentary, who have a list of all of the registered hate groups in the US. They're the ones who kind of label certain groups as hate groups. Groups like the Westboro Baptist Church, groups like the Proud Boys, and the ISUPK was one of them in the area, and they really stuck out because they were the only non-white group. It was all these in Oklahoma. It was all Nazi groups, neo-Nazi groups, white supremacist groups, that kind of stuff. And then it was like they were originally called Black Separatists, and then they've relabeled it to like general hate because then their views as a whole are kind of a bit hateful, and it's not just about kind of black supremacy or black separatism.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was able to kind of get in touch. So basically, the man who I speak to in the documentary is a man called Captain Ugawop, who is the captain of the Oklahoma branch. And I called him up, and it just so happened that when I called him up, the entire branch had COVID because it spread like wildfire in Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously I couldn't really film when there was no group there to film with. So I just kind of checked in with him every couple of days by message or by call for a couple of weeks, build up a bit of kind of repertoire, because as a white person, they're very standoffish. I mean, I think I benefited from the fact that they probably saw me as a British journalist before a white journalist or a white person. And then with the fact that I built up a good, like, kind of relationship, like professional relationship with Captain Ugawop, he was a bit more open. And I mean, if you go and you look at the documentary, the first encounter that I have is we're in a children's park. Captain Ugawop comes and shakes my hand, and the other names, the other fella's called Ayash Kabawad, and Ayash comes and frisks me and searches me, and is a bit more less trusting, I guess, of this random British white fella that's just rocked up in jogging bottoms.
Yeah, that happens during the opening minutes of the documentary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of, and I mean, later on in the documentary, you can kind of see that they have like a ISUPK Dallas come up and help them preach, and the difference between me shaking hands with the captain, which by that point I'd spoken to him for a couple months at this point, maybe or a month over the phone, and then ISUPK Dallas, who didn't want anything to do with me. They were a lot more militant. It seemed they were a lot more like, this is the enemy. This is a white person.
Mm-hmm.
Especially as a member of the media, because a lot of their kind of coverage is like hit jobs, I guess, or some local like TV news in the US will interview them and then just make them, I guess, seem crazy or extremist or that kind of stuff. Which I went into it obviously not agreeing with any of the hateful views that they have, but wanting to not just, there's no point me having an interview and just slandering them and making just having an argument, I guess, or not opening avenues of discussion, because then what you're going to have 30 minutes of I guess a scrawny British fella arguing with a group of
there's nothing in the documentary that I thought was confrontational between yourself and the group. The way I run on my podcast, you let them do most of the talking. So,
there was one flashpoint. I mean, that is, I guess, I would argue the kind of main, the closest to any conflict that comes in the documentary. There's a bit at the end where I kind of blast the captain with some questions, but then at one point we're in the park, and Ayash Kabawad, who is a 6'2", 6'3", kind of stocky African American man, was asking me to get down and kiss his boots to essentially like say sorry for slavery, and that was a point where immediately I was like, well, I can't get down on the floor. There's no way, like that, like. They do this weird thing, the ISUPK, where, and I mean, like, sometimes you'll see politicians do it in debates, or you'll see it's just like a kind of weird, almost manipulative tactic where they will go, "Do you disagree with slavery?" And you go, "Oh, of course I do." No one's going to ever stand there and go, "Yeah, I agree with slavery." And then they go, "Oh, well, if you disagree with slavery, you have to do this. You have to get down and kiss our boots." The members of the Southern Poverty Law Center said that. They play on a lot of people's white guilt, kind of to get down and kiss the boot of this group, and I refused, and it became like I showed them the majority of the kind of discussion in the documentary, but after then, like the way I felt it was that it was a bit more with Ayash, it was a bit more, I guess, almost like a bit of a stalemate.
Mm-hmm.
Like he tried to on camera get me to go down and kind of bend the knee,
Right.
and you've got to then, you're very vulnerable as a journalist. You've kind of got to go in and be molded by the people that you're speaking to. Yeah, I can't push any sort of agenda that I have because no one is watching the documentary for me. I'm
Right.
certainly not at a level of journalist where that is a that is a thing. But I'm a kind of purist in the case of I wouldn't want someone to watch the documentary for me. I would want someone to watch it for the content and the interest that comes from, I guess, the interviews and stuff like that. And there's weird times where you have to then abandon that and then have to push back a bit. And I guess that was one of them.
Yeah, well, it's refreshing to hear a young journalist that doesn't want to use the what's the word, the flashcards, to the sensationalism,
Yeah.
So, but I thought you did it properly in that they did most of the talking,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess the average listener will either approve or disapprove of what they're saying based on what they're saying. You don't need to put your own commentary into it, which is a good
Mm-hmm.
approach on your part.
I kind of
Um,
think that people who watch documentaries out of their own volition, I like to think that people, you can't spoon feed people.
mhm,
You can spoon feed people with some kinds of media, but if you're going to sit down and watch a documentary, especially something that's on quite a hard hitting issue,
mhm,
the people, you've got to know that the people who are sitting down and watching it are smart enough to make their own minds up. If
right,
I could make it a hit piece on them, but if people are going in to watch the documentary going, I already agree with these groups of views, then me just sitting there and I guess just constantly giving them shit for it isn't gonna wash out well. Like
right,
if anything, it could put I guess gas on the flames of these people are being downtrodden on, because even the
right,
white journalist is coming up and taking the mick.
right. Yeah, it's counterproductive that way.
Mm-hmm.
I, without getting too into the weeds, but I remember about 20 years ago, there was a big to do here. I'm in the New York area.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big to do because Columbia University wanted to have the leader of Iran to speak.
Yeah,
And of course, there was a lot of people that were against him coming into the country. A lot of the students were saying, well, this is a land of free speech. You got to let him have his own way. And so there was like a big argument whether he should be allowed to come here or not. And he was. And he gave a speech. And then he started talking. With somebody in the audience, one of the students, asked him what his thoughts on homosexuality in Iran was. And his response was, we don't have homosexuals in Iran. So I guess the point I'm making is
yeah,
sometimes you let somebody speak and they'll either promote their idea or hang themselves,
exactly.
by their own words.
And you've got to rely on people who then listen to that kind of rhetoric to be intelligent enough to go, well, that
Yeah.
person is wrong.
Yeah, you got to trust
And if
you got
people
to
are
trust
big,
the common sense sometimes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that's why it's a difficult. There's a weird line of being a journalist at the moment where, or I mean, like there's a documentarian who is kind of like always be my idol growing up. He's the person who got me into wanting to be a documentarian. Is Louis Theroux, and he's always kind of specialized in kind of the weird parts of the US, and then it goes on the BBC, and everyone goes like, God, they're weird over there, kind of thing. But he's done a lot with kind of he's done a couple with white supremacists, and he did one recently with like kind of far right incel groups, and he got a lot of flack from certain publications and certain reviewers that basically said you're giving people a voice that shouldn't have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same way, it's like those discussions have to be opened. I believe anyway to a wider audience
Mm-hmm.
to because otherwise then they fester in their own echo chambers, and then you get places like the website Stormfront, which is like just a website for neo-Nazis in the US.
Right.
It's like if they're just bouncing off each other and they're not being held to task by kind of journalists in the public interest,
Right.
and you end up with, I don't know, people speaking on forums and organizing to go meet at rallies and stuff like that.
Um, so when you and I first started communicating, obviously I watched that documentary, and again, I really kudos to you. What awards did you win on that?
So I won an award in I won an award. It was the Oregon Documentary Film Festival. I won
Wow.
a documentary award there, which was that was the first one. And the University of Oklahoma flew me and Adam out, the cinematographer, which was just, I mean, we got absolutely bladdered on top of the Hilton on the university's expense. But I mean, don't tell them.
Well, that's all
So
the
that was
classes. See, that's all the dorm classes you missed during COVID. You made up for
exactly.
it.
I was making
Yeah.
up for it on
Hmm.
the kind of SEC money that was coming into the university.
Right.
And then just recently, whilst I've been in the UK, I won an award at the Southwest Center Film Festival in Oklahoma, and that was essentially best Oklahoma film. So any film filmed in or by someone from or something to do with Oklahoma, which is obviously a smaller award, but I mean, I'm a budding documentarian. Like
Right.
anything is unbelievable to me.
Right. Right. Well, you have a curiosity. That's the key.
Absolutely.
And I have to ask, in the age of the internet, social media, is the usual avenues for documentarians still exist, or are they bypassed by YouTube or like yourself starting up your own podcast?
I think absolutely, but I mean, like in the old age, there's no way I'd be able to. There's no way I'd be sit here talking to you at the age of 22 with a documentary
Right.
that is free to watch. Like if it was before the age of the internet, I mean, some of the like Louis Theroux, for instance, who is the most famous documentarian in the UK,
Hmm.
the person who got me into the craft, and he wasn't a journalist. He fell into it. Like
Hmm.
there were limited avenues anyway, and I guess now the avenues have broadened elsewhere, but where it used to be,
Hmm.
I guess you kind of either have to be poached by someone or you can, I guess, join and start from the bottom. But it very much is a case of almost like who you know and not what you know. And
Hmm.
then if you have a portfolio, if you have the craft to show it, like this kind of documentary that we put together on a shoestring budget, and I edited and did everything for it.
Right.
I feel confident enough that I can go to an employer or some sort of production company and kind of go, if you want me, I'm here, kind of thing.
Right.
But I mean, my kind of, unless something amazing came up, my avenue has always kind of been um, carve out this career for myself and then see where it takes me, I guess.
Right.
Because there is so much more opportunities now. I mean, you see it with stand-up comedy. Comedians are just filming their own specials and putting it on YouTube and then gaining recognition from that.
Right.
It's what Shane Gillis has done
Right.
to the nth degree. Um, I think it's opened up avenues for so many different professions, especially kind of journalism and documentarian making.
Yeah. Well, that's what, because I guess you say you're 22, so you must be coming to the tail end of your college career,
Mhm.
if you're
Yeah.
not, if you're rapidly approaching, and you want to do this for a living as a career. Uh, have you investigated how does a documentarian in today's social media age get financed for his or her
So
projects?
it's a weird. So I mean, I have a job that I have a job offer for after uni that isn't to do with documentaries. It's ironically to do with podcasts.
Oh,
And I guess the advice that Mike Betcher gave me after we won the first award, and I was kind of having a drink with him, and he basically said the best thing to do, you can get a job or get, maybe start at the bottom at somewhere like the BBC or something like that, and then in your spare time put in all of the effort to doing your own work, and then
hmm,
eventually one of them takes off or they meet in the middle, and then you I guess accelerate forward. It's a weird niche career to have to try and get into, but
hmm.
in the same way, it's like how many people do you meet that want to be documentary filmmakers?
Yeah, it's not a well traveled road, so that's an
No.
advantage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. So again, when I was investigating the real Black Sabbath. I should be calling it that. Um, I tripped over a lot of your other ones, which I guess are podcast related.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked to neo-Nazi groups.
Mm-hmm.
You've spoken to a survivor of the Jonestown massacre.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get involved with all of them?
Laura Johnson Cole, who's the survivor of the Jonestown massacre, was my first taste of any sort of kind of, I guess, taboo or gritty, to use the word of the
Hmm.
podcast,
Hmm.
kind of natures of interviews. I mean, originally, like every other lad who wants to be a journalist in the UK when you're like 15, 16, whatever, every lad wants to just write about football, like the real football, or go some sort of sports journalism or that kind of stuff. Usually, anyway, and that's where I was at. I was doing a lot of MMA kind of coverage and going to events and stuff. And then I just fell into this interview. Like I just decided to contact. I found the email for Laura, who was a survivor who had written a book. And I just decided I was 15, 16 at the time. I would have been 16. And I just floated her a message, and she was so kind of, I guess, welcoming to a young journalist. I mean, in my opinion, looking back, I'm so grateful that I did that interview, and it's led me down this path. At the same time, I was so underqualified to be able to tackle such a task, because it is a very. I mean, Laura was she didn't like run away from Jonestown or anything. She was so high up in Jonestown that she was sent out to do PR in Georgetown in Guyana to try and integrate the settlement more with the capital city. And then when she came back, everyone was dead.
Right.
So
Right.
she's scarred by it. She's everyone that she's known and loved from the group was killed, was
Hmm.
murdered in her words by Jim Jones. And then from then I kind of got a weird taste. I guess I wanted to follow up with these kind of, I don't know, these societal groups that are on the fringes that people don't really know about. Or I mean,
Hmm.
you mentioned the neo-Nazi one. The neo-Nazi one was again a difficult one to kind of navigate, because it wasn't just listening to someone's stories and allowing them to speak a lot more than me, which is so important. With the neo-Nazi one, if I let him speak too much, then I'm just, again, going back to what was said before, I'm giving a platform to
Right.
the head of the Nazi party in the US.
Right.
So like that's almost like a debate, that podcast really. I
Hmm.
basically call him out on everything that he says
Right.
repeatedly, and then it ends.
The one.
But I mean, it's quite.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was gonna say the one thing, because maybe it's because I watched like one right after the other
Mhm.
of your work. How much in common that fella, the neo-Nazi guy, had with the ISUPK fellas. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's hard to say they have a lot in common when you think about it, but
It's kind of not, because ironically their views are the polar opposites of each other.
hmm
Really, they would not get on in a bar with each other.
but they both wrap themselves in a Christian blanket,
Yes,
so to speak. And
absolutely. And
yeah,
it kind of it falls into this thing of, the idea of the political spectrum. There's kind of a model of the political horseshoe, which basically means that if you're at the extreme on either end, like you don't connect and you don't overlap, but you're not that far away from each other,
hmm
I guess, because it goes around like that. And so they have, I mean, even the fact that both, despite the ISUPK will call themselves Jews, they don't
yeah.
like Jewish people. They're very
hmm
anti-Semitic, just like the neo-Nazi fella.
Well, they consider themselves one of the lost tribes of Israel.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah. So they
Yeah.
are Hebrews rather than Jewish.
hmm
Um, and then it comes into all this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric. And again, it's the same with, like, both of them believe that the Jewish man runs the media,
hmm
and that the Southern Poverty Law Centre say that they're just looking for a boogeyman, and that
Right.
Jewish people have been a historical boogeyman
Right.
for centuries. I mean, for millennia. So it's they are very similar in that regard. I think the weirdly uncomfortable thing is that, despite the fact that the ICPK was so hateful, there was almost a part of me that had kind of sympathy for them, or like that I could kind of go, I understand why you have those hateful views. Whereas my aim for the neo-Nazi interview was to find out why this man had such hateful views, and I couldn't. He didn't give he dodged the question every time I asked him. He couldn't give a good reason. He just went back to using slurs, and it raised an interesting question whether the kind of people are kind of natured or nurtured into having this hate.
Right. It did seem like he was well versed enough to not hang himself with his own words.
Yeah,
If that's a good way to say it. Before we keep going, do you mind if I share for the folks who watch us rather than listen to us your YouTube page, just the cover of it?
absolutely.
Okay. I'm getting good at this, I think. This is where I screw up normally. There we go. So there's your YouTube page. I don't know if you can see it on your end.
Yep.
And if the folks that are just getting acquainted with Mr. Robinson could see, he does a lot of podcasts. And have you done any other full length documentaries, or is the real? Yeah.
So the Real Black Sabbath is my debut one. It's the only full documentary that's there.
Okay.
But the aim is to film a documentary through the whole of this year, and then by, I guess, the next film festival season.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any specific areas you want to get into the weeds on?
I've not told anyone this.
Well, don't tell us either.
No, absolutely. I really like the idea of. So in the 60s and 70s, I've got notes like just piled up of kind of documentary ideas. But in the 60s and 70s, there was it was heroin assisted therapy was a big thing in the UK for people that were kind of addicted to heroin. They were using heroin to wean people off heroin, whereas, and then in the 80s, it got replaced with methadone clinics, which is a kind of more chemically altered and engineered drug, and then people were getting addicted to both heroin and methadone, and then now they're starting to implement more heroin assisted therapy. So I'd love to do something kind of on heroin addiction and how more facilitative therapies are being used to wean people off and that kind of stuff. It still needs a lot of airing out. I've not started filming anything, but that's the goal for my next year, and something will be released at some point.
Yeah, I always assume a documentary before the first record button gets pushed, there's a hell of a lot of research that has to go on first.
Yeah. A lot of kind of legwork beforehand. But I mean, I started filming the Real Black Sabbath in October, and then I sat and edited everything over and over again, and I finished editing in February. So that was a lot of kind of sleepless nights editing regularly after we finished filming in maybe like November. And then it didn't get released until July because I had to wait for film festivals and stuff like that. Right. But I mean, like for anyone who does fancy watching it, I mean, there's also optional captions. I know of people that are deaf or who struggle with the kind of accents in the documentary, and I didn't want. There's no point putting effort into a project for them to then exclude, I guess.
Well, I think that's what our viewers are watching now, because I am showing a little snippet of it in the middle of the documentary. So I have to ask, these fellas you interviewed for the ISUPK, have they gotten that? Have they seen it? Do you know if they've seen it, and what their thoughts are on it?
I know. So I've not spoken to Captain Ugawop directly. I know that the West Coast branch or something have seen it. So it's definitely gone round to them, but they've not reached out to me afterwards. But I maintain that it's not a kind of puff piece for the group, because I say in the documentary that I believe that their views are hateful, and I do push back a lot, especially at the kind of end. But at the same time, it's probably the most neutral piece of reporting on the ISUPK that the ISUPK have ever received. They don't really have anything to be angry with, because again, it comes back to that thing of if you're going to believe this group, or you already believe them, then whether I don't believe them or whether I think that their views are crass or not isn't really going to sway it. But I make it clear that I do think their views are crass, but it's not a hit piece. It's a more investigative and more kind of, I guess, discovering where this all stems from.
Right. Well, they were able to bring their ideas forward. They seem to be very articulate or knowledgeable enough about where they come from
Mhm.
to speak about it.
Yeah, it's a lot of kind of, sometimes if they don't know though, they will revert to scripture and they'll just kind of shout scripture at you. That was a
Yes.
kind of I mean, sometimes, I mean, they will during the preaching they would say scripture and then they would have to get the dictionary up to realize what they'd actually said in the scripture, because there was a lot of kind of old Hebrew words that
Hmm.
don't really make any sense.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, they did mention the Bible quite a lot during the
yeah,
documentary. Yeah. Yeah. But so now you have a lot of episodes that I still have to listen to more of them. I was able to catch two or three of them in preparation for this podcast. Uh, do you seek out these guests generally?
yes, I've
Okay.
never, I've never had a guest come to. I mean, personally, I've had people come to me in the past asking to be on,
Mm-hmm.
and I've said no out of the fact that, like, I'd rather have a curated, very kind of niche, um, I guess, group of people that all fit into a weird line
Uh-huh.
of a weird kind of subsection.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of my earliest, you can tell that if you look at the way the episodes go, they progressively get almost more um out there at times, and
Mm-hmm.
um but yeah.
I just happened to notice, and I haven't seen this one myself, but you did a Waco survivor. So you are very American centric, it seems.
I, I think, I mean, not to be insulting, but I think a lot of the mental people are in the US.
Well, if you
I
want to
think,
focus on that, you'll have a never-ending supply of subjects to talk about.
well, that's why I was so eager to film whilst I was in Oklahoma, because, like, I wouldn't have the kind of funds to be flown out to the US to film
Mm,
something early on, I guess,
hmm.
like in my career. So I wanted to film whilst I was there, because in the UK we don't have people screaming on street corners, kind of preaching the Bible often, or if you do, then they're not worthy of making a documentary on.
Yeah,
Um, so that's why I really wanted to kind of grasp that opportunity.
yeah. So there's a lot of legwork involved if you're going to curate specifically the types of subjects you want to cover.
Yeah, which is why, I mean, there's only 15, 14 episodes of the podcast. I want to make more now that I'm back from the US. It was a
Hmm.
bit more difficult to film kind of organized stuff whilst I was out there.
Right.
Um, but and they're very kind of curated in that way that
Hmm.
I have to be very interested in the story, I guess, of the person,
Right.
because otherwise I know that I won't pull my weight. I mean, like, me myself, I'm epileptic, so sometimes, like almost like ADHD, my brain can trail off. I mean, it's a hurdle I've had to overcome quite drastically for journalism,
Right.
because you can't be in an interview and kind of go off, or lose your words.
Right.
Um, but if at least if I'm engaged by the person I'm speaking to, then it's no problem. Like, it's a lot easier.
The thing that's nesting in your head now with the methadone heroin as a potential next documentary. I know I keep saying documentary instead of documentary, but
Oh no, I
anyway,
like it.
I don't know why. But anyway, do you have to reach out to people? Like, are you coming to America, or is this going to be?
This would be based in the UK whilst I'm
Oh, in the
here. So I've still
UK.
got another
Okay.
year at
Hmm.
university. So yeah, I'd absolutely reach out to people. It'd be more how I'd work out how to film. I mean, this is still like a very budding kind of idea, and it might come to the bit where in a year's time I release a documentary, because something will be released in the next year, but I might release something and then it's not the heroin idea. I might have latched onto something else by then.
Hmm.
But I'd have to kind of cast a net and try and get the right people and the right subjects, and, well, I guess, contributors. They're not really subjects, because they are agreeing to help me with the. Do you know what I mean? That
Yeah.
I don't want to seem like I'm some kind of overseeing scientist in a
Right.
lab.
Right.
Like
Right.
these are people with stories that are just.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky enough that they're sharing them with me.
Well, that's the thing. You approach it like you want to do this documentary so you personally can learn more. And if the end user, so the listener or the watcher learns more too, that's what it's all about.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I think as you go further into your career, obviously the more podcasts you do, the more documentaries you do. I don't know why I'm saying that way.
No, I love
Um,
it.
yeah. The more contacts you'll have, and that'll lead to other. It's like a tree and branch type situation, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, like, so like there are people that I've spoken to in the past that I know full well. If I were to go down the kind of heroin route,
Hmm.
would would have people either know of people to speak to, or they'd be willing to speak themselves or that kind of stuff. Again, I mean, journalism very much is who you know and not what you know.
Hmm.
As long as it's crafted well,
Hmm.
it's all about I guess contacts
Right.
yeah.
Do you have a website for your podcast?
Not specifically for the podcast. So I set up when I was 15. When I first got into journalism, when I was 15, I set up my own website, which was called All Out Attack.
Hmm.
It was originally called All Out Attack Sports, which is where the name of the podcast comes from. I mean, the website's kind of redundant now because my portfolio is almost entirely on, I guess, the YouTube page.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Right.
and like if I write a journalistic piece now, because I used to just do interviews for the sake of doing interviews, um, mainly with sports kind of people. Whereas, like, if I do an article now, then I pitch it to newspapers and it'll
Uh-huh.
get into the newspapers instead of me
Hmm.
just sitting on it and having it as a portfolio because I'm not kind of 15, 16 anymore. So it was originally All Out Attack UK or All Out Attack. I think it's changed the name now to UK. But I don't have a kind of website specifically, I guess, for the podcast.
Hmm.
But the way that you would find it, I guess, is on my Twitter. If you wanted
Okay.
to, yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be
Well, in case, if someone's watching our podcast and they may want to reach out to you to maybe partner up with you in the future or,
absolutely.
do some financing, they could reach you through Twitter.
Yeah, so my Twitter is at Robbo Harry, ROBBOHARRY. And
Okay.
that's the same for Instagram and Facebook.
All right. So I'll grab that and put that in the show notes as well. So anyone watching or listening to us would like to reach out to Mr. Robinson, they can get a hold of him through Twitter. I don't know. YouTube is hard to get a hold of somebody on YouTube, but anyway,
Yeah.
yeah. So you're 22. University of Sheffield's going to be saying goodbye to you soon,
Mm-hmm.
and the rest of the world will be getting involved with your work as we go forward. Do you have a writing element too, or is it all video?
Yeah, so the I was almost before I got into the podcasting, I entirely did writing.
Uh-huh.
I've done some. So I mean, one of the most recent features I did, I interviewed people in Uganda.
Uh-huh.
It was about the kind of political corruption in Uganda and the nepotism and that kind of stuff, and how the country was pushing back. I also have done one of the interviews that with the kind of, I guess, taboo groups. I interviewed the two survivors of the Heaven's Gate.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, which is so that went out in a newspaper, but also I guess the article is on my website, which was just a WordPress website. I guess
Hmm.
it's just sat there. I mean, I did that quite a few years ago. But yeah, so like I write features and stuff like that. Mainly, I've done a lot of it through the university course and stuff,
Hmm.
and then they go out into either the local paper if it's just a news story of. So I do a lot of journalism kind of writing, but my main passion is to go into broadcast and documentaries. Everything kind of splinters off into this, like roots of a tree, I guess.
Yeah, you have a natural talent for it. I think that's
Oh,
a good
thank you.
a good venue to explore. Sure. Um, so Harry Robinson, all the way over there in the UK. And the name of the podcast is All Out Attack. Where are you located on the audio portion of that?
It's on Spotify, Amazon, Apple. I
Right.
think everywhere, and then I guess Podbean as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Podbean pushes it out to the rest of them. That's
Yeah.
essentially what we use. We don't use Podbean, but that's how we get to all those other places too.
Yeah.
It was a great honor having you on
Thank you
on the
so
show
much, Tom.
tonight,
It's an honor
and
to.
we're looking forward to more of your work going forward. You have a promising future.
Thank you so much. It means a lot.
Okay, Mr. Robinson. Have a great evening, sir. Oh, before I let you go,
Yeah.
so they're getting a lot of news from the UK. You got a new
Yes.
prime minister. The other lady lasted a couple of weeks. The queen passed away, unfortunately. You got a king. What the hell's going on over there?
It's a, can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a shit show, man.
Yeah.
It's just. I mean, I'm not. I don't lean the way of the current party that is in power, so I'm obviously going to be very critical. But I mean, I don't think there's anyone who. The problem is that like so to put it into perspective, so this prime minister that was elected, not elected, that was appointed yesterday, is the third unelected prime minister that we've had since 2016. To put it into context, North Korea have had 3 unelected leaders also, but since the country existed. So, I mean, it's the country's just a shambles, really.
Don't they still get asked by the king or the queen to, or is that a formality?
No, yeah. So they have to meet. They meet with the. I mean, again, the kind of way I lean, I'm not a very royalist person either, but they have to meet. They have to meet with the monarch once a week, and I guess the monarch says what they think of things. A lot of it is formalities, though. So every law in the UK, every bill has to be signed off by the monarch, but they would never not sign off on it. Like
Right,
if King Charles decided that he wasn't going to sign off on a bill because he didn't like it, things would be set on fire.
Was Boris Johnson elected?
Boris Johnson was unelected originally and then won an election.
I see.
And then he was going to run again for the leadership for this premiership that's now gone to Rishi Sunak. But I mean, the last 12 years have just been a shit show. But
what was the lady's name that was prime minister for a cup of coffee?
Liz Truss.
Yeah. Why did she resign all of a sudden?
Because she was crap.
She found out herself that she was.
She was awful. She didn't turn up to prime minister's questions, and the direct quote from the leader of the house or whatever that stood in her place to answer questions was that, oh, she's not hiding under a desk. And it's like, and then we're all meant to take. So she had no support of anyone in the party at all. She'd absolutely tanked the economy.
In 2 weeks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she killed the Queen. and then took for the first like 10 days of her premiership, Parliament was on leave because the Queen had died, because there was all formalities and that crap. So she she tanked the economy when she finally did implement like a mini budget that was horrible. She then U-turned on that because it had tanked the economy.
Well, you got to give her credit for that. 2 weeks she was prime minister, right?
It's impressive.
It took our guy a year and a half. She did it in 2 weeks. Come on.
And then she U-turned on that. Even little stuff. She forgot to vote on her own bill. She forgot.
Nice.
The big thing was that she got outlasted by a lettuce. Did you see that? That there was one of the newspapers put a lettuce on a table and put it in a wig with eyes and like a smiley face, so it looked like Liz Truss. And the question was, would Liz Truss outlast this lettuce? And the lettuce won.
Well, on that happy note, I'm sure happy days are coming the UK way. We've been speaking with documentarian Harry Robinson. His podcast, which I highly recommend, is called All Out Attack, which there'll be a link to both his podcast and his his Twitter and his YouTube page right in the show notes. So thank you, Mr. Robinson. We're looking forward to your work in the future, and
Thank you so much.
You can count me at least as an avid follower going forward.
Absolutely. And if you ever want to get in touch for a chat, or
well, I have a feeling we'll talk again down the road, sir.
Absolutely.
All right. Have a great night.
You too. Thank you.